So now I'm going to start part 2 of this talk on social networks and show you some of the evidence that links social networks to health. This is one of the very early studies looking at the relationship between mortality risk from all causes of death and social networks. It was work that I did in the mid-70s, looking at an area in California, the Alameda County study, and looking at data that were never collected to understand the relationship between mortality and social networks. So in this study, we looked at whether people were married or not. We looked at whether they saw friends and relatives and how many friends and relatives they had. We ascertained whether they belonged to any kind of religious organizations, and we asked whether questions about voluntary or civic organizations. And we added all of that into one scale, which we called a social network index. And the idea was that it spanned both intimate ties, if you think about the Boissevin model, as well as extended ties, weak ties, volunteer ties. And we looked at people's risk of dying over a 9-year period. And what we found was that people who had lots of ties across all of these domains had really low mortality risks. They're represented in the light blue bar. That's the lowest one. And then as people became increasingly isolated, that is, they lost ties, their mortality rate increased till by the time they had very few ties, those people in the purple bars, they were about 3 times as likely over this 9-year period to die as people who had many more contacts. And in this study, we controlled for tobacco and body weight and exercise, health services, how they rated their health initially. And these factors reduced this association a little bit from about 3 to about 2.5. So it opened up a huge field in which we wanted to understand, well, what was it about living in a way that's so integrated that could be so protective of health? This is another study that actually shows almost the same kinds of findings, looking at health professionals in the United States. This is in 2000, looking again at all causes in the bar farthest to one end, and then looking at heart disease, cancer, accidents and suicides, and all other causes. And you see the relative risk again ranging from about 1.5 to over 2. And there are now a number of these studies. In fact, this meta-analysis that we referred to before has 148 of them, all showing things that look very similar to this. So to skip to a more intimate tie, to show you the evidence about intimacy, this is a survival curve that looks at whether people were either married or had a confidant, and their risk of dying if they had relatively high cardiovascular risk. So this is a group of people who were at high risk for cardiovascular disease, and it's looking at their survival by whether they were married or had a close confidant. And what you see is that if you were unmarried or had no confidant, in the yellow bar, your risk of survival was much, much worse. About just over 50% of those people survived over a 5-year period, whereas almost 90% of people who had either a spouse or a confidant died during that period. It was pretty striking in terms of the evidence here. Here is another study that looks at the same kind of thing, looking at emotional support after somebody had a heart attack. And here we ask the question, is there anyone you can count on to give you emotional support? And we asked that question before they had ever had a heart attack or anything. It was a long-term study. And then a number of people went in the hospital, had had a heart attack, and we looked at their survival after they had a heart attack. And what we found is that over half of the people who said they had no one to count on died in that 6-month period, whereas only 23% of the people who had 2 or more sources to rely on for emotional support died. So enormous difference in risk, in mortality, in surviving a heart attack by this emotional support. Now, one of the most important things about this is that it didn't matter who it was who provided support. It didn't have to be your husband or wife or your close friend or your sister or your brother. It was whoever you defined as having somebody. So this is one of the reasons that network and support studies are so important, because they don't assume, oh, it ought to be my partner who provides emotional support, or it ought to be my sister. It just doesn't matter. What matters is that somebody does. So this gives us lots of options as we think about societies in transition for understanding that people need emotional support. That's clear. But where it comes from is a very different question. So here's a very clever study that I always love to show, because it first of all illustrates the importance of social roles and social networks, but it also shows the link to infectious diseases, not just chronic, non-communicable diseases. And it's a very tightly controlled study in which the guy was, Sheldon Cohn, who did this, was very clever. So he asked people a set of questions about their social networks and support, and then he actually expose them to a cold virus by inhaling it with, in your nose, and then he quarantined people for 6 days. And during the 6 days that he quarantined them, they sat in a room, they weren't allowed to see anybody else. He measured the Kleenexes. He measured how heavy they were. He measured how much you sneezed, what your temperature was, all kinds of things. He did a lot of immune studies. They drew blood. So they tried to figure out who got the cold, given that everybody was exposed. So this is a study in which everybody's exposed to the virus, but just like in real life, you all know sometimes you're exposed and you get the disease, sometimes you're exposed and you don't get the disease. So this is the risk of actually coming down with a cold by the number of social ties you have. And again, you see that in the far corner, where the odds ratio is 1, people who had many contacts and roles were actually protected from getting the cold. And people who had 1 to 3 roles were 4.23 times as likely to get a cold as people who had many kinds of ties. And this is kind of interesting, because in some ways you would have thought that you would have been exposed to a bunch of other things by having lots of other friends. But this shows once again that being isolated before you ever went into quarantine in some ways is related to the risk, to your resilience, to your risk of getting what is, in this case, a common cold. Now I want to show you something that's more complicated, and I want to preface it by talking about caregiving a little bit. Caregiving is a very important function of networks. It is something that I hope everybody who's in a network will do at some point in their life, that all of us have to take care of other people, children, partners, family, neighbors, parents. But there's been a lot of question about whether there's a toll that caregiving takes on people, whether this is actually burdensome. So this is a study of over 50,000 women who had information on caregiving and actually who had information on cardiovascular heart disease, CHD, in a follow-up period, and what their risks were. So what I want to show you is that people who had a heavy burden of caregiving, that is, took care of people more than 9 hours a week, had an increased risk of having cardiovascular disease. This was among people who were taking care of a disabled or ill spouse. And you see the toll that this takes. Now, one of the things that we have questioned, and one of the things that's always conflated with caregiving, is that you're taking care of somebody who's potentially fatally ill. So the loss of a loved one is also terribly important. And it's not just the hours of physically taking care of somebody, it's also that you're losing somebody who you love during this time. And we actually don't find these same kind of risks in terms of the same hours taking care of other people. So that gives us a clue that there is something about the loss as well as the burden of caregiving. That's really important. I want to show you another study that links social integration to cognitive resilience. This is the pathway of social engagement. So this is a study from the Health and Retirement Study. It's looking at 4 waves of data and looking at older people, about 16,000 people. And we looked at social integration very much in the way that we did originally in the Alameda County study, whether people were married, whether they had volunteer activities, and the contacts they had with parents, children, and neighbors. And here what we see is that people who had high levels of social integration were more likely to maintain their memory over time than people with low levels of integration. And our thought was that many of these people are retired, that what's going on is that the sheer energy and commitment that it takes to be engaged with people and talk actually serves to help your brain. So it's sort of a use it or lose it. As you remain socially engaged and you remain with people in your community, you in fact are sort of forced by this level of engagement to use your memory and your brain in novel ways. And it turns out that this is actually quite healthy. So there are many, many examples of the ways in which social networks influence behavior and the norms that have strong impacts on well-being. I wanted to talk about the Framingham study a little bit because that was the next generation. However, what I'm going to do is use these Framingham methods to talk about the next phase, and to emphasize to you that caregiving has both an upside and a downside. That is, caregiving is very important. It's a vital function for all of us to do. Societies wouldn't be sustainable without caregiving, and we just have to think about what the balance of that is overall.